Welcome to the last day of this very important and, as I understand it, very exciting conference. I'm Julia Unwin. I'm the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and we're incredibly pleased and proud to have played some small part in supporting this conference, because for us, the issues of housing policy, housing research and housing practice are absolutely central to our mission of addressing poverty and disadvantage. We don't believe we will ever in the UK have a return to proper, sustained economic growth and any form of prosperity unless we tackle poverty. And we don't believe we can do anything about poverty without starting to address the huge national crisis that is housing, not just in the UK, but across the world. We also are hugely committed to the notion that how we learn across countries, how we transfer knowledge and expertise must be part of the clue to how we progress into a new and different future. So for all those reasons, Joseph Rowntree Foundation is really pleased to be supporting this event. But I'm delighted to be chairing this session. One of my tasks is to keep you to time. One clock there says it's 12:30. The other there says it's 7:20. You're going to trust me. I'm going to stick to time and use my own watch. The two speakers we have today are both people who I think bring enormous value to the final debate of this session, which is about how we bring housing to the forefront, how we ensure that concerns about housing are not just an arcane, rather peculiar concern of some of us in this room, but are actually central to our notions of.
I'd like to congratulate the organisers of the conference. I've been involved in organising ENHR conferences previously, even in Scotland. I think you've done a fantastic job, and I think everyone's had a great week and been really impressed by how smoothly things have gone. So from me, and I'm sure from many other people, thank you very much. I'm also delighted to be on the same platform as Julia and Ian, the Rowntree Foundation and Ahuri are two organisations that I've had a particular respect for a very long time indeed, because, as you know, much of the work I do interfaces into debates and discussions about policy and the development of policy knowledge. And I think that globally they have been the two most successful organisations, certainly the two most successful I've worked with, so I'm very pleased to be here today with you. And the last thing I'd just like to say is that I retired from my full-time position in the University of St Andrews at the end of March, and some people say, does that mean you're in retirement? Actually, Susan Smith, and I'm sorry Susan's not here today because she's always stimulating, but she might have also explained to you how I once managed to get locked in the bedroom of her flat in Edinburgh, but perhaps I'll tell you that later on. Susan has coined a phrase which is researchment, and that's what I'm trying to do. I spend a quarter of my time in Glasgow and a quarter in St Andrews, but I want to thank my colleagues from the Centre for Housing Research. Over the last year, they've discussed many of these issues with me, particularly my colleague Julie Mao, and really shaped my ideas in this. So this is, in many senses, a team effort of people from the Centre for Housing Research, and any errors in the missions are mine. But let's cut to the chase. I want to talk about the, if we can get to move, essentially a proposition. I think that housing research and housing policies are essentially sidelined. We know that housing processes matter. We know that housing outcomes matter. That's what we do. We would naturally think that. But is anyone listening to us? When we've had all this discussion this week, when you've been putting forward your best foot, your best results, has it made any difference to things that will actually happening? Is anyone listening? And there are two levels I'd ask that question. First of all, within big academia, within the mainstream social science disciplines, within the research councils that support these disciplines, is anyone listening to what we are saying about housing and housing systems and housing outcomes? And beyond that, within policy, is anyone listening to what we say and what we do? I think that we have a real challenge, not just in a sense for our own self-respect about what we do and making our beliefs credible, but in terms of better outcomes for the environment, for the economy, for the society, we have to see housing return to the centre stage of policy debate. It is so far away from it in most of the countries I now work in. I think that we have to make a new case. The new case is it's not a sideline issue. It's not simply a social justice issue. But if we really want to understand capitalism and how it works and how it evolves, we've got to understand this big, complex market state, non-profit system that affects so many dimensions of well-being. Let's not be marginalised as housing researchers. Let's not be marginalised within the policy or research communities, but let's make our case about why housing has to sit at the centre of modern thinking about how economies and societies function, about modern thinking about how you deliver better policy outcomes. We, I think, when we take up themes about inequality, we'll talk about how inequality creates bad housing outcomes or shapes poor housing outcomes for lower-income households or people who have no incomes. And we think we're being quite sophisticated in saying, well, if we look at this, there are path dependency effects, there are spillover effects, there are dynamic effects, capabilities are eroded, we reinforce poverty traps and the like. Now that's important, and it's really important. But is there more than that? Is there something about how housing systems don't just reflect and minor reinforce inequality, but are actually fundamental in shaping the big inequalities? That's a different question. Not do we, in a sense, simply reflect and reinforce, but are we core to the inequalities that emerge? And that's the proposition that I want to address as we go through. Now, we might say that we don't have to be too worried about inequality. We know that housing policy emerged in the late 19th century to deal with the cruel habitations that emerged in countries like this and cities like this with the fast urbanization and industrialization of Western economies, North America, and so on. But the private poverties that we saw at that time were very rapidly translated into public squalors. And these public squalors created an outrage amongst the greatest authors and literature of the time. They created an outrage on the part of and unlocked the pockets of some of the great paternalists like Joseph Rowntree showing an interest. But also, they unlocked the energy and the insight of essentially people that worked in public health systems in 19th century cities. That was where housing policy came from in Scotland. It was the spillover effects. The private property created the public squalor, created the externalities. Everyone was buying into dealing with the spillover effects from dealing with policy. And you all know, I'm not going to dwell on this for long. Many of you in here know the stories better, certainly for your own countries, about policies after the 20s, development of welfare states and beyond, until we get to the late 70s, 80s. But if you think back to that period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, market systems that SBG are, not the state systems, not even the corporatist systems, even the market systems in that period had significant housing policy expenditures. Housing policy expenditures that in proportions of GDP are now significantly higher than the corporatist or even marginally welfare reform systems that we talk about. So the reality was that regardless of the broad standing or structure of policies, there was an effort to deal with redistribution, to deal with housing as a central concern across a whole suite of approaches to domestic policy. At that time, public expenditure, about 4 to 10% of GDP, and sometimes public expenditures as much as 10 to 15%, was actually going into housing programs, often housing investment programs, significantly lower now. We're talking, I know the instruments have changed, and we're dealing with housing allowances rather than public housing, etc., but we're talking 2 to 3% now, I suppose. So poorer societies 50 years ago, poorer Britain 50 years ago, poorer Scotland 50 years ago, spent 5 times as much of its proportion of GDP on dealing with housing policy and housing poverty than it does now. As we become richer, we've spent less on housing policies. Now, is this because inequalities have withered away, that somehow we don't have an issue to worry about, or that somehow housing has become unproblematic? And the answer to that, we know, is a definitive no. If we look at the global experience of income differences across the world, there have been some encouraging convergences in average incomes between the South and the North. There certainly has been, with globalization, some convergence of income levels across different countries. But within each country, and this is true not just in poorer countries, it's not only true in the BRICS that are emerging so quickly, but it's true in our systems as well, we've seen a really significant increases in inequality. Significant increases in inequality. Inequality, as you know, is becoming a more severe problem, and we're doing less to deal with it, at least in housing policy terms. I think that within my own profession in economics, there was really a shocking neglect of issues about distribution. Even the way we taught economics, we stopped teaching welfare economics to people about 1976, and have only really begun to return to it in terms of thinking about the fundamental aspects of distributional outcomes rather than just simply market efficiencies. In other words, we trained a whole generation of economists that could talk about the efficiency of small, simple changes and not make any real distributional judgments, nor understand how systems actually functioned. Now, distributional outcomes and how systems functioned are what we have to deal with. We don't have to deal with narrowly defined cost-benefit questions of one single instrument after another. But I think that's professionally, and some of you as economists may disagree with me, but I think that that's what I've seen taught in economics in the UK in the last 40 years. But at the turn of the millennium, at least in economics, people like Stiglitz and Sachs were saying, this is different. We've got to think about the cost of inequality. We've got to recognize these differences and move on to a different perspective. So when we're dealing with inequalities increasing, what's happening to housing? Well, we know that increased inequality and increased rents and prices have led to significant problems of paying for housing. And almost every advanced economy almost invariably now focuses housing policy on affordability. I always say housing supply is inelastic. The use of the English language is extraordinarily elastic, so that affordability now means how to help middle-income homeowners more often than the poor, the last 10% of the income distribution, and so on. So that this has been the focus of housing policy. And in a sense, we've kind of conspired in that. We make so much of our publication discussions about affordability. We have not paid sufficient attention to the fact that the housing systems we deal with are fundamental failures within them. Why the American view of how to talk about housing economics prevails is because everyone concentrates on the efficient system. A more distinctly European view, and I think relevant in fast-growing countries elsewhere, is about market failures and why the market really matters. And these are market failures. If you don't believe in market failures, just have a think about 2008 and finance is too easy. That's too easy a goal for me to score. But you think about the market failures that are in dealing with environmental issues, the market failures that are in aligning health, care, support for older people. These are part of our big housing challenges. The market failures that are in markets not responding to the new challenges and demands coming from younger people. So housing policy, we've let it become devoid of a lot of discussion about distribution, but focused on an affordability debate that largely ignored the imperfections that there are within the system. So that I think that we, in consequence, have significant issues, not just problems, but opportunity within housing policy. We could change things, and we need to do so for the better. But, and I'm going to move on a bit more quickly here, we have evidence of diminishing government action in housing, but we know that households are still concerned about inequalities. And social surveys show that people are not just concerned about themselves, but about others. Altruism or social insurance objectives are not dead. but they seem to be dead in the way that government would design our housing policies. If we look at global assessments of housing need across a whole range of countries, and you see really sophisticated assessments of housing needs and demands in countries like Brazil and China and so on, this isn't just something that European countries do. They're rising really sharply. In the BRICS, for instance, we've heard much about the growth of a middle class and their housing aspirations and meeting them. In reality, informal housing demands, squatter demands, are rising faster than the affluent middle classes are growing in these settings too. So that we have real challenges in this. But there is no talk of a global shelter crisis in the international agencies in the way that people will say there is a great challenge to issues of international security. There is a problem of aging. There's a problem of the environment. There's a problem of unemployment for young people. But nobody coherently addresses the global shelter crisis. So we fail when that happens. We're starting at the top of these international agencies, right down to domestically, we don't get people to talk about what matters. Within nations, I've talked about reduced commitments, and I published a piece in Housing Studies last year about how very often the drive to localism, and this occurs in the BRICS and it occurs in the other countries as well as in Western Europe, is very often the dumping of policy obligations on more local autonomies without any elastic fiscal base to deal with rising housing problems, to deal with housing systems that are increasingly local, global in their connections, and are increasingly shocked by events from outside. So, in a sense, we're making dealing with housing issues and housing problems more difficult and ignoring them at a global scale. So housing's lost as a big system, but how do we get it back in the core debate on capitalism and inequality? Well, at this point, enter centre-left Mr. Piketty. And I want to talk fairly quickly about this. There is a paper that my email address is in the slide at the beginning, and I'm happy to circulate a copy of that paper that Julie and I have done. Basically, I think Piketty's analysis, and by the way, I don't believe in rock star economists, and because I was never one myself. If you'd treated me differently over the years, I would have been quite an approval. Actually, I'm sorry for the aside. The 5 years I spent in Canada, I performed frequently in public platforms with Richard Florida, whom geographers unfairly have come to hate because he is so smooth and he gets about $30,000 per presentation. And I always thought it was quite amusing. I would try and dress, as you know, I dress better now than I used to, but that was his influence. But that was the only influence. He would go along and talk about the creative class and bohemian society, and I realized he was giving the talks about the bohos, and I was talking about poverty, so I was getting to talk about the bohos, the hobos rather than the bohos. Anyway, that's where I realized that there's limits in being a rock star type economist. But Mr. Piketty, who seems quite modest in some ways, is, I think, given us an interesting opportunity here. Now, I'm not saying just go and lift this, but there's 2 or 3 fundamental things in it that we have to take on from our interests in housing. He's done fantastic work, and I'm not going to go into what he has done, but put this question of the concentration of income and wealth, not lost in a Gini coefficient or a Lorentz curve, but we would call it politics of envy in this country, but I would call it effective communication, where he talks about what the top 1% have, what the top 10% have, what the top 20% have as a share of either national wealth or income. Let's get to the specifics, in a sense, is what he's saying. And before his book was popular, he's published about 7 or 8 really outstanding papers with other collaborators across a whole range of different settings in really first-rate economic journals in the last 12 years. His book is the recent synthesis. But, I mean, what he's telling us, if we look in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and you more civilized Europeans, you don't get off either. This just happens to be how I could get on the graph, of how inequality fell and then rose again. I'm just going to flip through them. They're just to make the point really quickly. If we look at the emerging countries, falling, rising significantly again. In other words, the patterns are there. And if we look at wealth, instead of just income, rising, rising, falling after the 1920s, beginning to rise significantly again. And in this paper for France, which 1700 to 2010, I think that, I'm sure some time series analysis in here would pick that apart. But the really important thing in this is the patrimony. He has a broad definition of wealth as capital, including housing and housing assets. This lighter portion here is the share of housing in total capital. So if you look from about here, right, into when housing policies really begin to change, look at how almost all, in the context of France, the growth in wealth and the inequality of that wealth is driven by housing wealth. Driven by housing wealth. If you do the same for the UK, it's a bit less pronounced. It's about 60%. And the US is probably less, about 50%. And there are criticisms of this that I'm not got the time to go into in detail. But I think if we look at it through the lens of applied housing economics, his measure of housing capital, I think, is quite adequate. And this evidence stands as a significant indicator. So if we're interested in housing and we're interested in inequality, this is saying, it's not just saying that income inequality creates housing difficulties. And it's not just saying, and there might be reinforcing effects within neighbourhood effects and so on. It's saying, look, the effect of big capitalism it now operates means that changes in housing wealth, the outcomes of the housing system, are driving the big wealth positions that will take place. Now, what implications does this have? And I think I would stand by this position, and there's evidence. There is an exceptional period, he says, largely between the 1920s and the end of the 70s, where a succession of events, of wars, welfare states, and so on, meant that as incomes grow, the key thing in his relationship, because I'm going to skip over my next few slides, is that his explanatory model is that where the rate of return on wealth or assets exceeds the growth rate of the economy, inequality increases, because there's a smaller number of people who have access to the gains from profits, and therefore it concentrates income, and therefore you have increased inequality. But he said there's a period between 20s and 80s where that didn't happen. But that's precisely the period that economic historians and economists take to shape up the evidence about the Kuznets curves, which basically says that you've got a U-shaped curve, that inequality decreases as societal income grows. Whereas, in fact, he's saying we're now back to levels of inequality that were last seen in the 1920s in countries such as the United States, etc. Now, have a look at the paper for a more detailed discussion of this. But the key thing is housing is at the heart. If you haven't read the 610-page book, there are some shorter commentaries to read. But the heart of the argument is housing and housing wealth. So how do we get to that? How do we deal with it? I'm just going to flip through this. Now, I'm really terrified of Julia, by the way. Everyone in here has never seen me do that before. And so, right, let me go back one then. There are some commentaries that say the housing dimension to this. There's a paper by Bonetti et al. From Sciences Po, which I think is technically incorrect, but it actually says it can wash away the wealth effect in Piketty's stuff for France. And other people say, oh, well, it's a kind of coincidence of the times. I don't think it is. And why I think it is a fundamental, and a fundamental for us is, we all are now informed and understand that we're going to have future economic growth, at least for the next 40 or 50 years. Economic growth is increasingly going to be concentrated in larger urban centres that benefit from agglomeration economies. No, it won't ever entirely work out like that, but let's stick with this story for a moment. In other words, we're going to have economic growth. It's going to be increasingly concentrated in the big cities and in probably global cities as well. We know that the supply side, within these systems, housing demand is income elastic, i.e. it will grow with incomes, and it's price inelastic, so that when prices rise in these places, it's still going to grow anyway, right? So you have a demand side that's running ahead. On the other hand, we also know from all the evidence that housing supply is most inelastic in precisely these locations. And housing supply is inelastic not just because of planning, which is the easy scapegoat for people who don't think, but it also reflects the cutbacks in infrastructure investment, the failure for systems to have any connected system between planning, infrastructure investment, and things that happen on the ground. For instance, Edinburgh's a very good example of that, but we won't go into personal grief, but do enjoy the trams when you're here. And when we come down to it, we know that this is where the pressures will be the greatest. And who will benefit from this? Existing owners of property and those who own land. And the longer the system takes to produce more housing, the better in that instance. In other words, the rate of return to rentier capital is going to increase in this model in the longer term. It's not an accident, it's not short term. R star for rentier incomes will increase faster than wealth incomes, will increase faster than growth. So if we don't like the wealth inequality patterns we have now, they are actually going to get worse under this future scenario. Now you might say, but this was exactly the scenario in the 19th century where we had fast industrialization, growth, constrained supplies, but we didn't necessarily have all this outcome, or at least we adjusted to it. Two things in the political economy are fundamentally different. In the majority of countries, we're all rentiers now. If we're all individual homeowners, it's not a few limited landowners or landlords that are taking the benefits out of that rentier income growth. It's 70% of the population that are taking the uplift in the price values. 70% is a majority of voters, and therefore we put in place tax systems, inheritance systems, NIMBYism, and a whole set of other constructions that continue to support upward shift in the prices and downward pressure on the supply. So we, in a sense, have to change the structure of the housing system and housing policy to actually deal with that. So the different political economy means that we really need to think through how we change this. But if we want a society or an economy or an economic structure where the basis of how we do is wealth and inheritance rather than effort, if we want social immobility rather than social immobility, we're starting to see it. The Leverhulme project I'm involved in that Beverly Searle has been running so successfully, I think you can begin to see in that those who have the housing gains are redistributing it to children who need a deposit to get into home ownership, or children's school fees, or whatever. It's creating that pattern of wealth we produced in Britain in the last 10 years is now shaping the social circuits for the future in a fundamentally different way that will reinforce inequality and that, in a sense, have to be addressed. So what I'm suggesting is the Washington consensus about how you run housing policies, maximize home ownership, all about tax incentives, has, I think, created a system that's gotten us in a mess and actually created not an entrepreneurial, effort-driven economy, but in fact a rentier economy where we need to do something about. Well, Julia, you'll be delighted to know my policy agenda is really a sort of mishmash of Henry George meets Joseph Rowntree, where I think there are 6 or 7 key things. Governments are dishonest about how they talk about housing policy, and they're accounting for it. In Scotland, it's now almost impossible, even if you've been a housing economist for 40 years, to actually read in government papers what they spend on housing policy and what they spend it for. And the UK as a whole is likewise. There's no clarity. People say there's no money for this. Yes, there are. All the implicit and explicit tax expenditures that are going into housing are huge. They just happen to be aimed at people in the middle and the upper part of the income distribution. So if we want a different system, we need to deal with that. I think the critical thing, at least in the UK, it'll be different in other countries, is we've had a naive approach to housing supply, and Glenn Bradley's written about this in the past, where we actually don't have a housing supply system that's changed really in any way that would actually allow much more flexible response, and we have to do that. And I think that we have to see a much fuller role for the state in assembling land, compulsory purchase of land, which went off people's policy agenda. I think it's a fundamentally important tool to come back to local governments and so on to make progress. And I think that we have to be aggressive about housing as an effective infrastructure. Other things in here about getting government to put an efficient system rather than maximum home ownership at the setting of their thinking. This applies not just in the UK, it applies in China, applies in Brazil, whatever. Thinking about much more contestability in the non-market sector than we have. And we are now, in a very ad hoc way in the UK, looking at the changing overlap between market and non-profit systems of provision and how that might function. And I know that these are issues of concern in the Netherlands, and Hugo was telling me the other day about the review of associations that are going on in there. And the other points I've mentioned, but also we have to have a system that stops creating the conditions to power the wealth and income inequalities that are emerging in our systems. And changing housing policy is not a minor part of that. But if we keep having the housing policies that we've got, we will actually just keep replicating. So that all the nice detailed recursive work we do at the other end of the system will have no impact. If you Google neighbourhood effects, and I'm quite interested in neighbourhood effects, there are about 250,000 citations on it. Almost none of them impact any policy decisions. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. Maybe we have to focus on some big things and big arguments. And I hope that in doing that, ENHR, perhaps maybe we need to think about. I always enjoy this conference at an academic level, and I listen to policy discussions, I go home and I think, well, so what? You know, we don't synthesize our policy insights. ENHR, I don't think, has ever managed to be a knowledge exchange platform between governments or international organizations and researchers. Now, I know that's difficult to do, but unless a respected organization like this ups the debate about our concern about housing policies across Europe into the European Parliament, but also into the Commission, but also into national governments in a much more effective way, we'll have actually failed. We'll have done all our research, we'll have done all our talking, and we won't actually have changed anything. So I think that we now have an opportunity with new ideas and new models. I'm actually, that's why I'm not retiring at all. I'm enjoying this refreshment. I'm going to write to Mr. Piketty and tell him why I support his position. If he analyses housing systems, you'll find some support for his point of view. So that's where I stand on this, because I think this is a major platform for us to use to make our cases that are well-based. We differ in many of the details of them, but I think it's a platform for us to stand on. Thank you for allowing me the time.
Our next speaker who's responding to what Duncan said is Ian Winter from Ahuri, which is based in Australia, one of the organisations that does bring together universities and governments across Australia and manage some of this knowledge exchange. Ian, can you reflect on what you've heard?
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you, Mark, and the organising committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'd also like to congratulate the organising committee on a terrific conference, but also I think all of you, as a community of scholars coming together, I think it's terrifically important, and I think the registrations are up over 500 or something like that, and that's testimony to your willingness to do the preparation, to come together, share and debate on what I think is a range of very important ideas. And if you'll allow me the indulgence, I would like to acknowledge the contingent of Australians who've made it across the NHR conference as well. Their efforts to sort of engage with international comparative research tremendously important to us in Australia, and I think we benefit enormously, not only from the informal exchange of ideas that happens through the conference, but from the formal framing of new projects and integrating international comparative research into methodological frames. Tremendously important. And of course, Duncan has been at the forefront of that, drawing together numerous international comparative studies, and thank him for his continuing energy and success in this endeavour, and perhaps he'll have even more time for that into the future. Look, what I intend to do is to quite briefly draw out 3 key points, the 3 key points that are key to my understanding of Duncan's paper. They may not be the key points in his argument, but they're my take on the key points that he's raised. And then from there, I'm just going to air 3 key questions that arise for me from his paper, particularly more in relation to the future of housing policy. Now, I don't have an academic pedigree in urban economics, so my response to Duncan's paper is made in the spirit of one of Christopher Hitchens' more memorable reflections, and I quote, "that you only find out what you ought to have known by pretending to know at least some of it already." So whilst this response is made with appropriate modesty, I applaud Duncan and Julie for the epistemological style of their paper. I've had the privilege of already reading through the paper. And Duncan bemoans a smallness of ideas tyranny, and he counters with conclusions that he claims have a universal relevance. Good, all more strength to you, I think, Duncan. On that note, let me try and get to the guts of Duncan's argument. First, on the back of Piketty's evidence of the long-run tendency of capital to grow at a faster rate than incomes, Duncan is making the case that housing is an increasingly important part of that capital, and thus that housing wealth is an increasingly important part of economic inequality in advanced economies. In an Australian context, this is a case that Judy Yates and colleagues have documented thoroughly, but perhaps what is most important about Piketty's work is the thorough international empirical documentation of this, and the fact that the argument has taken off and has got some widespread interest. That might be a significant opportunity for us. The second key analytical point that I take from Duncan's paper is, and I quote here, that housing in this view of the world does not just mirror income inequalities, but it also drives wealth inequalities. So the key point here is that the housing system, the interplay of the market with government regulation, with government assistance, is not just somehow benignly and passively reflecting inequalities from the labour market, but is actively generating and reshaping those inequalities. It puts the housing market processes front and centre as a driver of those inequalities. Now, the old-style urban sociologists amongst you, such as myself, who hark back to pioneering work by Wrexham Moore in 1968 on housing classes, may be experiencing a little giddiness at this point in time, but I understand that entirely. While some of these arguments are not new, we should not bemoan the fact that, in fact, there is an opportunity now to rejoin some of these debates. The third key analytical point I take from Duncan's paper is that the new era of wealth positions will be driven by inheritance rather than effort. And as he terms it, driven by rentier rather than entrepreneurial behaviour. So this, he argues, will have important implications for productivity growth and social mobility. And he captures this in very nicely paraphrasing John Stuart Mill in his paper. And I quote here, "Too many people may simply progress by lying in their beds sleeping as property values increase. And sleeping with the right person will come to matter more as inheritance grows relative to earned wealth." And it's the progression of these 3 analytical points that leads Duncan to a fundamental concern about the future of productivity growth and to seek to restore the intellectual connections between housing, productivity, and inequality. And for that 3-way set of connections to become the core of future housing policy. And I think he's raising for us the research project, the need to document those links between the housing system and productivity growth more thoroughly than we have to date, although he may well wish to comment on that further. So then, what prospect of restoring the intellectual connections between housing productivity and inequality, and what prospect of this being at the core of housing policy? Duncan's paper has suggestions on both these fronts, and I'm going to leave the intellectual question for your collective debate later and focus on that second aspect of the prospect of housing productivity and inequality being at the core of future housing policy. And I do so in acknowledgement of the title of the conference, Beyond Globalisation, Remaking Housing Policy in a Complex World. So that's going to be the focus of my final sort of 3 points, key questions that arise for me from Duncan's paper. I guess the first sort of question or issue that I was gnawing away at me as I was working through the paper was, will these observed housing inequalities become the basis for social group formation? Will these observed inequalities become subjectively meaningful? As Mike Berry expresses it in his new book, The Affluent Society Revisited, what is too much inequality? What is the tipping point? Now, these questions, it seems to me, are important in relation to the policy debate, for they signal whether or not housing will become an aspect of political debate and political fault lines. They signal whether or not politicians, and thus policy, are likely to be focusing on these housing inequalities. So is there going to be some sort of connection between these observed inequalities and whether or not they're going to become subjectively meaningful in some sort of way? Social group formation, political fault lines. Second, will a focus on unequal outcomes play to a policy conversation? I'm sceptical of this. I think policy will continue to be much more comfortable addressing inequalities in housing opportunities rather than inequalities in the housing outcomes. I think it will continue to be more politically palatable to help people onto the gravy train of home ownership and rising property prices than to slow down or stop the gravy train, even though such policy actions are likely to be self-defeating in a context of constrained supply. Third, and this is my final point, if we are to place the intellectual project of examining the connections between housing, productivity and inequality at the core of housing policy, then, as Duncan has said, we have to take the process of knowledge exchange seriously. We cannot just assume that a successful intellectual project will have an impact on housing policy. Academic commentary on the impact of research on policy seems to split into two quite different camps. In one camp, the theme is an inward-looking self-flagellation. The discipline is at fault. The methods are inept. There's just a lack of personal commitment. And bizarrely, geographers seem to dominate this camp. In the other camp, which is more the habitat of sociologists, academics are written out of the story altogether. The lack of impact on policy is everyone else's fault. They've got no agency. It's the structures of governments, bureaucracies, and funding agencies that are to blame. Yet in my view, neither of these camps is a correct position. Knowledge brokering or knowledge exchange is a specific activity. It's not an extension of a research project. It's not a bolt-on to the research project activity. It's a specific activity that needs dedicated funding and fit-for-purpose organisations to undertake it. I don't think it's about academics or policymakers needing to show greater interest in one another. I don't think it's about how the message is written. I don't think it's about academics needing to change how they do what they do. On the contrary, universities, I believe, need to continue to do what they do best: theoretically informed, conceptually robust, and methodologically rigorous research. And they must maintain the independence of their research effort, for this is critical to the ultimate value of the research. I do think that knowledge brokering is about dedicated, fit-for-purpose organisations that at their heart drive the relevance of research to policy through managing a process of engagement between researchers and policymakers. The interests of academics and policymakers do not fit hand in glove, thank goodness. And these interests, I believe, need to be brokered by a third party, an honest broker who brings the parties together and keeps the parties apart as required. Other key roles for the knowledge broker organisation are to secure the ongoing research funds, to protect the intellectual property that's created by researchers so that they can retain publishing rights, to actively disseminate research findings into the policy and public settings through publications and events. And very importantly, to play the long game, to be the custodian of the evidence base, if you will, and to keep prosecuting the implications of research findings for policy across changes in government, across changes in the bureaucracy, and long after research teams have had to move on to new projects, new pieces of work. If we do all of these things, then I think, in my view, we stand a much better chance of joining the intellectual project that Duncan has mapped out to the core of housing policy debate. I commend his paper to you. It's a terrific read. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. A really tremendous summary and response. Also, for my benefit at least, a really good description of what Joseph Rantry Foundation is trying to do. And I don't think I'd put ourselves in the knowledge exchange gap, but when you talk about the long-term dissemination and making those connections and links, that is where we're positioned. We've now got time for questions and comments from the floor. And I can't see many of you, so you may have to wave rather dramatically if you want to get my attention. But who would like to start? And I think questions either for Duncan or for Ian, or comments on what you've heard, which has been wide-ranging, but also pretty challenging to some of the discussions you've had today. So there's one up there. Thank you. And I can't see. Thank you for all the waving. That's fantastic. Could you say who you are, particularly as I can't see you? Yeah.
Jane Ball from Newcastle.
Hello.
Any advice for us lawyers who have to put it into effect?
Jane, thank you. Good question. Now, who's going to... Ian, role of lawyers in the picture you'd painted about how policy gets affected.
Well, I guess I haven't really considered that thoroughly, but
Start.
Yes, start. Don't become part of the problem, I guess. I mean, I think, let's at least let the policy ideas develop. Let's get the policy thinking clear and not worry about how it's going to be enacted in legislation until later down the track. Surely you've got the expertise to translate the policy intent into the legislation rather than getting the cart before the horse.
Duncan, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the law, in a whole range of ways, is actually at the centre of some of the patterns we see in terms of maintaining them and shaping them, and also obviously changing them. I think that where you see this, I think, most evidently at the moment is that one of the outcomes of the distributional shift in wealth is that if you get 25 to 35-year-olds, if they have parents who have substantial wealth or grandparents and they they can access housing wealth from them or some transfer of wealth to them. And about 80% of first-time buyers now have some substantial dollop of cash from parents or grandparents in the UK. If they can't do that, they end up in the market-rented sector. And we know that the market-rented sector in Scotland has doubled in the last 15 years in size. And we know that it's increased substantially in England. And it's not just the fact that there's poorer people that can't get into social rented housing and now, in a sense, queuing to get into social renting from there, but also more younger people living longer. And that begins to raise all the rights about tenure. In other words, the tenure system that we have is potentially consistent with a population that will move in and out of renting within 2 or 3 years. But when you suddenly have people who are going to be 10 years in renting, then we have to think about a very different set of rights. Sorry going on about the example, but it's a very practical example of why rebalancing the rights that people have to property, and particularly rented property, is going to be really critical for those who don't have access to the wealth, as an example.
You'll allow me to say something about one of my bugbears on this, which is really significant to the contribution of law. We're quite good in this country, and I think in most countries, at coming up with policy ideas, and we very rapidly move to implementing them. The bit in the middle, which used to be called policy design, is where we always fall over. It does seem to me there's a very particular role of different disciplines, and law is rather critical in that, in the design and future-proofing. You only have to look at what we've done in the UK on welfare reform to see how dangerous it is to move from bright idea to implementation without some very careful design and testing of that sort. Right, yes, Glenn in the middle.
Glenn Brownlee.
And then
question particularly for Duncan, but also Ian maybe. I agree with, I think we probably have similar ideas about trying to increase housing supply radically, but I'd be interested in your view on one particular issue, which is, okay, we want to see more public spending and investment in this area, but it's always going to be limited. Would you put more of your eggs into the basket of doing what some people want to do, which is lots of traditional council house building or some social rented house building, or would you in fact use those scarce resources mainly for infrastructure to unlock larger scale urban extensions, new settlements and so on, to actually enable large scale house building and use then planning powers to ensure that a proportion of that is affordable and social housing, rather than put all the public money directly?
Good question. I'll ask both of you to respond.
I think there are three parts to the answer. In my view of the world in terms of policy, given where we've gotten to with rising rentier incomes, with significant gain issues always arising in planning decisions and infrastructure decisions, I think that we need a legal framework but also a planning mindset and capacity which is much more about sophisticated gain extraction. In the post-austerity, where we're talking about real restraints on expenditures, even tax expenditures, taking the land value increase becomes a central and not marginal element of housing policy, and we have to get much better. When I said earlier I didn't think we had a proper housing supply system, what I meant was we did have a really effective housing supply system in the UK that built 350,000 houses a year, where the central government would decide how much money it was going to spend on housing. It would give it largely to councils, who would decide where they were going to build it. They ran the planning committee, so they zoned the land, and they also provided the infrastructure. Over the last 30, 40 years, we've unlinked almost all of these different things. So we have organisations that do planning, infrastructure and investment, but they're not a linked system. In fact, I think actually the new deals that are emerging in English cities are quite interesting, because by putting the investment plan at the centre of decision taking in these metropolitan areas rather than the planning decision, the infrastructure decision or whatever, it's going to force politicians to actually have an integrated perspective on infrastructure and planning that they used to leave until after all the deals had been done. They can't do that now. So yes, and at that point you do have to think about how you use some of the money for infrastructure strategy. That said, I do think there has to be some care in reconstructing the social rented sector. I think there's a very good case for a significant expansion of the social rented sector. But if the government strategy or anyone else's strategy is simply to give large amounts of money to any council, I wouldn't support that proposition, because the experience of the past was some will do it really well and some will just waste the money. And I grew up in Glasgow and spent a lot of my time trying to persuade them to stop owning council housing, so I can't support all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I would want to reject the sort of the binary proposition that you're making. It's housing or infrastructure. And in the Australian context, we have these siloed from a policy point of view as well. We have them siloed from a research point of view, much to my frustration. We're not able to get research funds from urban planning and urban development agencies. They see housing as a separate entity altogether. And I agree. I think in the Australian context, we've been arguing for getting rid of residential stamp duties and replacing with a broad-based land tax, partly to sort of capture some of that uplift from infrastructure investment.
And can I just supplementary on the point? I think the point in infrastructure is really important in terms of how it connects to our discussions in ENHR, because it's a connection between housing, city issues and wider economic and social issues. And there are people like Hugo, for instance, who have done lots of work on infrastructure, but I've never found ENHR a context where I would ever come and talk about infrastructure decisions. And maybe your metropolitan group is the place to do that. I spent 5 years as chief economist of a federal government department dealing with infrastructure. I've never been asked a question about infrastructure in Scotland, ever. But it shows you how people identify.
And I think, I mean, in relation
He's a housing
to
guy.
in relation to the productivity agenda that Duncan's raising for us, I mean, that's where the infrastructure becomes critical too, in terms of understanding urban productivity growth.
There was a question just behind, yeah.
Yeah, well, short remark and a question. First of all, Duncan, is it not too much Anglo-Saxon in your story? Because if you look at, for instance, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, but also I think Germany, the researchers are very well involved actually in politics. Sometimes there's even the discussion that we're too much involved. Lots of researchers are very active in press, etc. People are listening to them. I think this is also something for Britain, maybe. My second remark is about the AHR. Of course, you're provoking that AHR should do more on policies and practice. I'm completely supporting that statement. That's also the reason why we have such meetings like general assemblies like this one. The last one, closing session, we had different ones in different conferences. So we try to involve policymakers. It's quite difficult actually to do so. I would ask all the researchers here to get your policymakers to these conferences. And we also will start a new workshop, policy practice actually. And I hope that a lot of people will join these working groups, so that is quite important. So yeah, we're trying to organize that, of course, but we need support also from the audience, from the researchers. And the third remark is, yeah, okay, EU policy, that's quite difficult. The subsidiarity policy, I don't know if we should put our efforts on EU because it's so difficult to get housing policy on the agenda in Europe. I think it's much more effective to do it in our own countries.
There's quite a set of challenges there, Duncan, isn't it? And is it true, and I suppose I'd ask both of you this, whether it's true this is a British disease that you're describing or whether you've seen it elsewhere?
I've seen it elsewhere, Peter. I don't agree with you on the first point entirely. I think there are more people directly involved in policy advice in some of the European countries than there would be here. The position here has changed significantly because the main ideas, influences on academics were always important when policy influence was being developed via the bureaucracy, because civil service researchers and others who used to come to conferences like this would actually pick up on things and know people, and if you were saying the right things, you would be introduced to secretaries of state and so on. Glenn Bramley's done a lot of that. I've done a lot of that. But things have changed where think tanks really matter. And if think tanks, some are quite neutral, others have a political leaning. And if a lot of advice is coming through the political system and through think tanks, then academics have a different role. They have to be really careful about how they play it. There's more of that here, but there are European countries I've worked in where academics were not at the forefront of the policy discussion. So I think there's variation. There are also academics in the UK who still manage to speak to government, and so it's not completely black and white. I think the point I was making was that I think you're right about it being difficult in the European Union, but the interface between national level discussions and ENHR is one I don't think that we work very well, because quite often if you're having a national discussion, people and ministers and others, they're interested in having 4 or 5 people from overseas. Now, we'd maybe do that always informally and invite other people. But I think that, for instance, and this is more true, given that housing policy strategies are increasingly now made by large non-profit organisations and councils rather than government departments, they find that difficult to interface with us. And it may be something like the Housing Studies Association in the UK has to be a kind of active transmission mechanism so that European expertise or requests to access European expertise get made through these national groupings in a more effective way. So, I mean, I wasn't complaining about how you do housing policy or in the Netherlands, and I wasn't complaining entirely about the NHR. I just think there's something missing.
No, we agree.
I think we have a common agreement there.
And I think,
Ian, how is it in
certainly,
Australia?
on my travels too, to the US and Canada, I've heard very, very similar stories about this disconnect between research and policy that people are constantly wrestling with, but also even within organisations. I met with people at the OECD, and they say they struggle to get that sort of connection between the research process and the policy development process. So it's clearly a conundrum. But I guess in relation to this conference, I've got a cautionary note there. I think it's important for the academics to have gatherings of academics to focus on academic issues. If you want to have an engagement with policy, do it at a separate conference. Have a specific conference where you're very focused on the policy development side of things. Don't try and bolt on that important process into this academic gathering. I think it's important to keep those roles a little bit separate, because otherwise the academic process just becomes overly applied. We end up back at Jim Kemeny critique. We're overly applied, overly focused on these things. It's important that there's a conceptual and a theoretical and a methodological debate at this sort of a venue. Do the other thing somewhere else at another time.
Are you agreeing with that?
Do I agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that.
I
You agree?
I agree with that.
Got an outbreak of agreement here. Yes, there's somebody over there. And then I'll take these two questions and then I'll come back.
Just one quick comment on the question.
Could you say who you are, just so everyone?
Sorry. Sarah Hilcock-Nalatambi from Swansea University in the UK. I'm an environmental gerontologist. I just wanted to make a very quick comment on the discussion about trying to keep separate policy and research. I've worked in the UK now for 8 years, and I haven't been able to get one source of funding for my research, even coming here, without having to justify the impact or the reason why I need to come here. We're in a funding system through the research councils which oblige us to talk about impact all the time. So I agree in theory with what our Australian speaker is saying. It's vital, but in reality we're very, very often constrained by the funding and the requirements of our funders to actually demonstrate impact. Even if we can't, I can't always, because we're asked to demonstrate short, medium, long term. I'm a social scientist. It's taken centuries to show the processes that we have to justify. So I think we've got to have a reality check as well. Yeah. And I think it's also up to the scientific community to start to stamp its feet and say we don't want to have to show impact sometimes. We want to be scientists.
Thank you. No, somebody just behind you. No, it's a very good point. Somebody just behind you. Yes, there. Yes. And again, who said?
From the Netherlands, Delft. Question to Duncan. How does your views go with the tremendous paradigm shift that is happening now in new construction? Housing policies for the last century have always been very strongly connected to new construction. And new construction is all over Europe and in the United States is dropping tremendously. Here it has been dropped below 0.1% of the existing stock annually. In the Netherlands already 0.5% of the annual stock annually. Finland is even worse. Everywhere in the Western Hemisphere, new construction has been enormously dropped. We have to do with the existing stock. And that changes all the kind of processes and policies, in my view, very much. And I never hear these kind of things. They are very much demand directed, and the views and the supply and the things that have been happening now in the last decades are almost ignored. Please.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Duncan to answer that, and then perhaps you could pick up Sarah's point about how funding changes behaviour, and then ask Ian to come in for some last words.
There was a book published in 1966 called The Structure of British Industry by a man called Duncan Byrne, and he talked about the construction industry, in which he said the construction industry is best described as a large and shambling giant, which has difficulty coordinating one foot with another so it might move forward. I always remembered that quote because it made me think of myself, because he was called Duncan. And I think that some of that is still true, but it's also true in the context of the deepest recession we've had, the deepest downturn. And in the specifically in the UK, but there are elements elsewhere, the nature of the construction industry is when you have a recession, basically you destroy the production linkages because you have so much small firm involvement, many of them go to the wall, reassembling. In other words, getting a construction sector ready for an upswing actually takes quite a bit of economic organisation. So we might still be in the early phases of any possible recovery. But that said, the experience in a significant number of countries is the level of the recovery will not match the surge in demand that will likely be driven. And therefore we are back to a discussion about a much more consolidated public intervention in the identification of land, markets, and the kinds of things that Glenn was talking earlier. And I think that changes, that's one of the fundamental changes in what I was calling rather cheekily the Washington consensus about housing policy is we have to have much more strategic state involvement in actually establishing land infrastructure and settlements in which we can build homes for people.
And can you comment on Sarah's point about the way in which research funding is driving particular behaviours?
Well, I think it does, but I thought it was slightly unfair in that you can actually get ESRC and others to fund discussion groups, working groups that are all about the idea, if you like, rather than the impact. But on the impact thing, let me turn my I'll try and be quick on this. I've worked in senior government positions in Scotland, Melbourne, and Ottawa. And I think the UK Research Council's view of impact is actually comedic, in that there's this notion that you write a brilliant paper, after you, the rest of you have been reviewing it for 3 years and finally agree to publish it. It gets in a journal. Meanwhile, there's some bright person in the research department within government saying, wow, look at this. This is how we're going to do widgets in housing. I'll run along to the minister's office. Well, apart from the fact there aren't so many researchers in government now, research groups don't have a particularly big standing within policy making within government in reality. And in consequence, how you get from there up to the minister's desk is a long process. Meanwhile, he's being bombarded, or she's being bombarded by all these other political influences through think tanks, people you meet in the canteen, somebody you spoke to at an international conference in Europe. So that the notion that you go for this linear process is frankly absurd. When I worked for Scottish ministers, there was an excellent report produced by the University of Cambridge, which arrived on the desk of the minister I was advising. And she said to me, what do you make of this report? I said, it's really excellent, and it should shift what we do about regeneration on our public housing estates. And she said to me, yeah, it's too bad, she said. It was commissioned by the last government and literally put it in the bin. And that was the end of it. So I don't want to discourage you. I don't want to discourage you, because I've seen other good things happen. But the assumption that there is about the way impact gets made is just naive.
And there is a whole lot of work that needs to be done on how we do this. We won't be able to discuss it for much longer. Ian, do you want to comment on any of this? I'm going to take one more question and then...
Yeah, just to pick up on some of Sarah's... I empathise entirely. Uhuru is funded by 9 governments and 9 universities. So we've got this pressure constantly from the 9 governments about wanting impact. One of the ways in which we try to deal with it is to shift the language. We don't talk about impact, we talk about influence. A little bit softer. We don't talk about evidence-based policy development, but prefer evidence-informed policy development. And I think it's important to sort of, just start to just frame the debate in slightly different ways, because there is a horrible instrumentalism from some policy people about wanting the sort of, there's the paper, there's the answer. And you do need to resist that. But it is also, I think, about having the people who are there for the long run, people who can keep working away at these issues over a long period of time.
I'm sorry I've misled you. There's suddenly a forest of hands, and I know I need to bring this to a close. So I'm going to thank Duncan and Ian very much, but then ask Mark Stevens to come because he wants to wind up the whole conference. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. Oh, you didn't bring that.
So to the closing part of the conference. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. First, I'd like to thank Duncan, Ian, and Julia for providing a most stimulating session. But now we come to the closing part of the conference. We need to do several things here. Of course, one of the most important is that Ivan Tošić will present the results of the slide competition. So, Ivan, could I invite you to come up here? And I think you have a memory stick to load up. So, whilst Ivan is loading up the memory stick, I'm now going to take advantage of these few moments just to give a few reflections on the debate we've been having over the past few days about beyond globalization and remaking housing policy in a complex world. And this is a discussion that's been enormously enriched by the discussion we've had today. But listening to some of the plenaries and some of the discussions here, I think within that theme of the conference, there are perhaps four main points that I at least have drawn from it. One is that it has reinforced the view that I have, and which was supported by a study on housing and exclusion that the European Commission commissioned several years ago, which I led and quite a few people in this room were part of. And that is that the housing policies that have and are still present in Europe can do a lot to weaken the link between income poverty and living in poor housing. I think an additional thing that I've learned this week, or has been appreciated this week, is that the legally enforceable rights that the Deputy First Minister was speaking about in the opening session, and which Beth Watts was speaking about in her plenary contribution, can be of enormous help to the most marginalised groups that are often left out of mainstream social policies. But we've also seen that these traditional mechanisms of weakening the link between low income and poor housing are being undermined partly by these globalization forces. The evocative term, the wall of money, that Manuel Albers was speaking about in the plenary on money yesterday. And the way in which the political economy of social policy and housing has been undermining the ability of or willingness of governments to continue to fund new social rented housing. We also have a problem that housing needs are becoming more complex, and in two very important ways. One is the connection between housing and energy costs. The general trend for energy costs to rise and means that housing is now intimately linked with fuel poverty, something that is very prevalent in the former socialist countries, but also now in the Western countries too. And on a similar theme, the importance of transport costs, because of the location of housing and how close it is to labour markets that are required to access in order to secure income. And I think that the thing that comes out of this, and again I think this was reflected in the discussion today, is that we have to focus much more closely on the role of land and of property, both in terms of land assembly, the kind of things that Glenn Bramley is speaking about in stimulating supply, but also fundamentally to address and to grasp the nettle of the case for a much greater emphasis on land and property taxation. On the final point that was raised today about the links between research, the research community, and policy. That has stimulated an idea, and that is that I'm one of the coordinators of the working group, ENHR working group on comparative housing policy, and we always meet outside the main conference because we find that people's principal affiliations are to other working groups, so we meet separately. And we have been planning our next meeting to be on the role of international agencies in housing policy. But I think the discussions we've been having today prompt me to think that perhaps we should broaden that to the links between research and comparative research and impact on policy design as well as implementation. So thank you for indulging me just then, and I shall hand over to Ivan for the slideshow.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, I will show you some slides because not every one of you could participate, unfortunately, in the competition. And we have really looked for many interesting places in Europe. We discovered Dublin, and I don't know whether you know which capital city is, but Bucharest, with very interesting buildings. Then we went to secondary cities, and one of the cities which not too many people know but is very nice is Geneva. And then Leipzig, and then Naples. Very interesting, different secondary cities, not so well known. Then we went to urban development, ideas and democracy. I think it's very important to understand who has right to different places. This is the South Bank in London, where skaters say that we are skating here for 40 years. Why do you want to take the place away from us? And the question is it really the place of the skaters or others? Who will win in this debate? Another very interesting case today is Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, which stays empty for many years, and obviously this use of the airport is nice. But is it really good that local people, white, middle-aged families, are downvoting the effort of the local government to build some social housing at the edge of the airport, leaving still a large green area? I think it's one of the most interesting cases of clash between democracy and rationality, I would say. Restructuring urban areas, an extremely interesting place, the deprived and derelict city center of Bucharest, which is now thriving and changing into a restaurant and entertainment district. This is a restructuring of Dublin, and this is a restructuring in Budapest, where a Chinese capital came in and took over an industrial place. And you can see Kőbányai út is the Hungarian name, but Shanghai Street is the other given name of the street. And then we also went to interesting cases like Dublin, where as a result of the crisis, housing crisis, a nice railway station you can see, and a totally empty area which couldn't be finished because the capital disappeared as a result of the crisis. And I have put this slide from the previous housing conference in Tarragona, where we had a wonderful bus tour to ghost cities. And this is a building nicely built 6 or 7 years ago, having one shop downstairs and all the building empty since then. Then we also had a visit at the lowest end of the housing market. Such places exist also in Europe. This is a peripheral housing estate in Košice, where only Roma people live, and the situation is really very bad. Then we had innovative ideas for social development, and I think that urban gardening is a wonderful way how you can include poor people, how you can include back into the society, and also the proximity food and biofood ideas are very interesting. Coming to the end, mobility innovations are always interesting, and I just found this nice idea that usually if you have a tunnel and cars have to pay, the larger the car is, the more they pay. But in Dublin, they discovered if they allow the very large trucks and the buses for free, then they will use the tunnel and they will not go to the city. So it's a reverse thinking about how you can make your city livable. Another example from Istanbul, where you have a tram station which you have to enter through an entry system like in metros. You trust people that they will use the entrance and they will not go on the tracks using the tram for free. So a kind of trust in the people. It was very interesting that not too many people knew about abandoned railway line in Paris. In Paris, you have a 32-kilometer long abandoned railway line within the peripheric, which is not used for 30 or 40 years, and no one knows exactly what will happen. This could be a new skyline for Paris. In some cases, it goes in tunnel. And then it was a very interesting place I discovered in an Italian city, a new way to create underground parking in a very dense historic city center. This parking place is automatic. It is 9 floors down, and each floor can automatically have a place for 12 cars. 108 cars can be parked here in a totally automatic way. Finally, this picture raised quite an interest. This is a picture taken in Istanbul, and this is how it looks like. And someone said that this is a housing infill under expressway. And some other people said innovative cultural heritage with roof protection. So, and this was also a picture which was not easy to find out. This is the London Eye, exactly from the side vision. And someone said it's an old missile silo, or London Eye has lost one of the legs. And this is the final picture I show. This, I like it very much. This is a street cleaning system in Paris. You would never think about it, that this water which comes out there is brown water. It's not drinking water. And when they have rebuilt Paris at the Haussmann, he had a very good engineer for drainage system. Paris has a completely separated drainage system for street cleaning with 12,000 such places water coming out. This is fantastic thing which not even the Parisians know about. So, of course, we cannot do it in our cities now because this would need a lot of money. Now, let's come to the results. And as usual, I will go from back to the top. And then I will ask the first 3 groups to come out. And I also have some prizes for them. So these are the results in a growing order. They were 16 groups, as you see, which is quite a nice participation. Hopefully you didn't discover yet your team. But now it comes more and more serious, and there are little differences. The third one is chill your base. So please chill your base, come out here. Second one, diversity. Okay, and finally the winner, the Tunstall team. Where is Tunstall team? There's only one person? You are wonderful. Okay, so I will now do my business with the winning teams because they have to select from the prizes. I hope you have got some impression what a slide competition is, and I hope we will be able to continue it. Last thing is that we have at 3 o'clock today afternoon an urban photo safari. Many people registered. Those who did not register can also come at 3 o'clock to the tower, Appleton Tower, and I will explain what the photo safari is and what we will do. Thank you very much.
Before we go, it's very important that we give some thanks So please stay just for a few moments, and we also have the important business of introducing the next ENHR conference. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for coming to Edinburgh for this conference. I hope that you've enjoyed it and found it worthwhile. The conference would not have been possible, at least in the form that it took, without the support of our two major sponsors, which were the Scottish Government and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So please show your appreciation for these organisations. Secondly, the main conference was preceded by a very successful New Researchers Colloquium. The New Researchers Colloquium this year attracted more than 50 papers and involved 25 mentors and other speakers. The New Researchers Colloquium is essential for the future of housing research, and I would like to thank very much Beth Watts and Janice Blenkinsop for taking on the job of organising the colloquium, which they executed with such enthusiasm and efficiency. So please thank Beth and Janice. The running of this conference has been helped enormously by our team of student helpers who have been manning the desks, pointing people in the right direction. It's quite clear that GIS technology has not necessarily caught on with all academics, and so their directions answering all kinds of interesting questions, which we may compile and circulate some other time. But please, are they here, the helpers? The helpers would like to stand up, and we can thank you. Yes, and just to name them, because they should be named, to thank them for their contribution. It's Linda, Kevin, Selina, Richard, Judith, and Jenny. So thank you. And the last part of the thanks is I think the most important and from my point of view most heartfelt. Throughout this conference, people have kept coming up to me and saying, "How are you coping?" And we received a lot of compliments saying how well it's been organised, but they keep asking, why don't you look more pressurised, and why are you still alive, and things like that. Well, the answer is very, very simple. It's the fantastic administrative team that we have had working on this conference, and in particular the team led by Cathy Lord. Cathy has worked with tireless enthusiasm and efficiency over many months in order to ensure that this conference ran so smoothly and enjoyably. She has been a fantastic person to work with to organise the conference, and in recognition of her contribution, we would like to give her a presentation to her if she would like to come up to receive it. It's farewell from Edinburgh, but we can already begin to look forward to next year's conference, which will be held in Lisbon. And I think João is here to present. Yes, please come up. To give us a little taster for Lisbon. So thank you very much, and we'll hand over.
Good morning to you all. First, I would like to thank Mark for this magnificent conference that we have had here in Edinburgh. So thank you to you and to all your team. We also would like to thank to the coordination committee who decided to support this project from Lisbon. This is a project that has been held by a pool of 13 entities between universities, public institutes, and housing-related private, well, non-for-profit associations. So it has been a challenge for us to prepare this. So we would like to welcome you at Lisbon, to invite you to be there. The general theme of the conference will be housing and cities in a time of change. Are we focusing on people? So this is the idea, aren't we sometimes more focused in master plans and great plans and things like that, but we forgot about the people and how it feels and what it needs, what really needs, and how it feels happy. So that's the main themes. We will have 4 conferences on these issues. And then, of course, all the workshops that usually work in the conference. We already had a web page and a Facebook and a Twitter, so that you can follow all this information that during the next year will begin. Let me just show. Oh, sorry for the. So this is the logo of the conference, and well, you may think what it is that, and it's very simple. That's the plan of the Lisbon downtown that was made after 1755, after the earthquake in Lisbon. So that is the main square of downtown Lisbon. And the different colors means the different areas of knowledge that this conference gathers. So it's architecture, sociology, so all kind of matters that are at the same conference. So that's the meaning of the colors. So as I said to you, there's also a Facebook Facebook page, and also a Twitter one. So please feel free to visit at any time. So, well, I think the images are not from the conference, but it's what you can expect beyond the conference, and to have a tremendous days at Lisbon. You know, Lisbon at this time of the year usually is hot. Next week will be around 30 degrees in Lisbon, and it's a magnificent city to visit and to stay. So also the invitation is not just for going to the conference, but to stay some more days and to know and to visit our city and our country. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you in Lisbon. I would ask you to pick one of those very small papers that it's right over there, those who didn't have it yet. Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, the date is 28th of June till the 1st of July. Okay? I don't know if I'm missing anything more. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll see you in Lisbon.